Hello to all our viewers today, October 9th, 2020. It's certainly been a tumultuous week politically, economically, and just socially. Another crazy week of pandemic USA, pandemic world. But Gruhn Guitars is still very much alive and well. And I'm still coming in 6 days a week, enjoying it thoroughly. And people still want good guitars, banjos, mandolins, and other instruments. We have lots of questions today, especially since last week when Jay Meyer from Martin was here. Almost everything we did was just addressing questions about Martin and things that Jay could help with. Today, I'm just going to plow into questions after one quickie introduction of an instrument that showed up yesterday. Once in a while, there's something that comes in that is just so unusual that even, there's plenty of instruments that may be unique in terms of it's the only one like it. If somebody custom orders an instrument, it can be the one and only. And occasionally, just because it's incredibly rare, it may be hard to appraise, but it may or may not really be something that ever took off. And people would look at it and laugh and say, that's interesting, but no, we don't want another one. But at any rate, I'm going to turn this camera around. I'm going to walk over to an instrument that was brought in yesterday, and I'll be able to tell you a little more about it. Many of you have seen and heard about Dobro guitars, but this one is a big boy. This is a Dobro bass from 1931, and we have photos taken way back in 32 showing a group with this, the Rancho Revelers, endorsed by Dobro. Pictures of Rudy Dopera with the band, and at any rate, you won't be likely to see any more of these. To the best of the research knowledge that we can come up with, this is either one, maybe two that were made. It's doubtful that there's another one in existence, but there's no evidence that this is anything but a prototype. But it was made that long ago because we have photos of it with the band taken in 1932. We also just got to see our cat Titus. He likes to meet and greet all the people who come in. At any rate, there it be. I'm going to set this down and get back. We have here a photo taken in 1932 showing that bass with the Rancho Revelers, and the fellow in the nice suit there is Rudy Dopera with the band. So it's an interesting instrument. Here's another picture showing the same band, and as you can see, it's dated February of 1932. So that is an instrument that is certainly verifiably that old. So far as what one would do with it, quite honestly, it really doesn't sound very good. Most any upright bass would sound a whole lot better. They tried to promote it, and it seems to have gone nowhere. But so far as finding another one, I don't think that could be done. It probably belongs in a museum, but it has been consigned to us at a price of $10,000. You certainly couldn't reproduce it for that amount. And so far as rarity, well, they don't get any rarer. Is it a model that really took off and became a great success in the marketplace? Absolutely not. How does one come up with an objective appraisal? Well, you can't really use prior sales or demand in evaluating it. There are no comps. And what's it really worth? Quite honestly, some things just aren't very appraisable. But for the right museum or collector, I think the price of $10,000 is reasonable. And at any rate, go find another. And then so far as a usable utility instrument, how many people would want another for the sound that it produces? Probably nobody, but it sure is interesting.
Was it played with a slide?
It was played as a standard upright bass. It's a fretted standard, it's a fretted bass neck. So it is also a very early example of a fretted upright bass. So it's a long scale, it's bigger than a Fender electric bass, but certainly Fender was not the first one to produce a fretted bass, because this one is way before Leo Fender. Gibson actually did make a couple of electric upright fretless basses with Charlie Christian type pickup back in the late 30s, but they were, I believe, two made. They were not identical to each other. I had one of them, and but this is a fretted bass that early. And so historically, it's plenty interesting. From a utilitarian point of view, not so much. Now we'll go onward to questions from our listeners. Roderick says, as a result of a recent social media post on a 1941 Gibson J45, Roderick wants to know why Martin dreadnoughts were more expensive than comparable Gibsons at the time. Well, I guess one of the things to ask is, yes, Martins of that period tend to be more expensive than most Gibsons of that period, but were they really comparable? For example, is a Martin D18 comparable to a Gibson J35? Well, the J35 was $35 when it originally came out, and later went up to $37.50. The D18 cost about $70, and it was really a much better made instrument. Or a Martin L00 in the 30s was $27.50, but a Martin, the Gibson L00 was $27.50, and the Martin 0018 was significantly more, and frankly was a better built guitar. The J55 mentioned is a model that was available in 41. It cost less money new than a D18 Martin, and the workmanship really is not equivalent. Martin guitars are impeccably crafted where they look great on the outside, but also if you stick a mirror and look inside, the interior workmanship on a Martin is definitely neater and cleaner than on a Gibson. But they also sound different, and there are people who play Gibsons exclusively and prefer them. A lot of blues players especially really like Gibson sound, and there are some extraordinarily good sounding Gibsons. But the general consensus is that Martins not only cost more when new, but will typically bring more than something with similar size and level of ornamentation than Gibsons. And typically, the Martins also cost significantly more when they were new. They are not truly equivalent. And even when you get modern guitars by a variety of builders, like, does a Collins sound just like a Martin? There's no, it doesn't. It's got its own sound. And it just seems like almost every luthier has their own sound, even if they're trying to aim for something that sounds remarkably like a Martin and may be the same size, the same shape, the same type of ornamentation, look virtually the same as a Martin, except for the name on it. They tend to sound different. And in the case of Santa Cruz or Collins, they often cost more money than some of the equivalent Martin examples. As to whether the sound is better or not, I'll leave some of that to personal preference. I have a very strong personal preference for new Martins over most other guitars, but the fact is individual guitars vary and individual luthiers vary in skill. And there are indeed some highly skilled luthiers out there today. Not all things that look similar are indeed truly equivalent, but we have more really good quality luthiers today than ever before in the history of the instrument. But again, I don't consider a D18 Martin to be equivalent to a J55 Gibson. And if you took a mirror in and looked inside of both, they certainly are not equivalent in interior workmanship. Ben says, I am the second owner of a 1966 D28 Martin, which had a lot of custom work done to it. Decorative inlay, scallop braces, herringbone trim on top. And Martin does not have a record of doing the work. The guitar is easy to play and sounds very good to my ear. The top is fairly well worn from playing and injury, and the Martin Service Center rep here describes it as in rough condition. The rest of the guitar is in fine shape. It has had a recent neck set, new bridge, and general going over, and needs nothing else at this time. Under what conditions would you recommend having a top refinished, and what would be the possible pros and cons of doing so? If so, what do you think it would cost? It would be an expensive job, but the point is I would not recommend doing that work. If the top looks rough, it probably has deep wear, gouges, scratches. If you're going to try to make it look almost like new, sanding it down to where everything is nice and smooth, and then refinish it, you're going to be reducing the thickness of the top, which will be less structurally stable and which will certainly alter the sound of the guitar, probably not for the better. And also, refinishing a top, new lacquer takes a long time to cure where it sounds the same as old. There are new guitars that sound really good, like our Sinker Mahogany Martins, new, sound really good. And there are plenty of new guitars by Collings and Santa Cruz and others that sound good new, but they still have a new tone, which is somewhat different from the tone that you get with a really old aged top, although some of the ones that new come closest to that old aged sound are instruments with a matte finish that is very, very thin. Or if you do a French polish finish, which Martin and most other manufacturers don't offer French polish as an option on their new guitars, or they don't offer, some offer varnish finish options, but varnish finish does sound different from lacquer. The point is, again, we do not recommend doing this to your guitar. It sounds good now, it's structurally stable now, and there's plenty of people who pay extra to get relic finish. Just say, when you pay extra for a relic, leave this one alone because it looks like a relic. And there's people who, Martin charges extra to do relic finish, and so does Fender. So live with it the way it is because it plays well, it sounds good, and every time you refinish one, you don't know what result you're going to get. But if you get it's hardly ever going to sound better than it did before. There's a high probability that it will not sound as good as it used to. Curtis Hansen asks for my thoughts on Fender Tone Master amps. And in general, I have no opinion on digital amps. I've never used one, and they don't have a lot of resale value, but they do things that are quite different from the old-fashioned style or a tube amp. And I'll have to say I'm not really qualified to have an opinion on that. Major DARS. I have a very old Fender Precision bass, and I'm trying to determine the year of manufacture. The neck is dated 12/17/51, and I'm unable to find any other dates on the instrument. Would this be considered a 1951 or a 1952 bass? The serial number on the bridge is 0352. It is my understanding that a 51 base would be more valuable than a 52. I don't want to mislead anybody telling them it's a 51 base. If it was actually assembled in 52, any guidance would be appreciated. Well, a date on the neck of 12/17/51 was applied before the neck was even lacquered. The possibility that that instrument actually was shipped or even went into final assembly in December is pretty slim. It was much, much more likely to have been assembled in 52. Is an early 52 base especially different in specs than a late 51? The answer is no. But Fender made necks and bodies separately. They didn't make the neck and body together. They all interchanged. So they made a pile of necks, they made a pile of bodies, they had electronic hardware all ready to go. And then when final assembly came, they put it together, but they could pretty much randomly pick this neck and that body and go together. So how do you date it? Well, it's not straightforward, but you can check the date code on the pots and see what date they are. But there again, the pots had to be made. They have a code that dates them to the week and the year, but that doesn't mean that it was installed in the guitar or bass at that date. Fender, they had to be shipped to Fender. Fender had to receive them. Then they had to use them. And so at least you can tell if the pots are original, then the instrument can't really be older than the date of the component part, but it could be newer than the date of the component part. Even on something as seemingly straightforward as a Martin serial number. Martin has a wonderful serial number system. They're consecutively numbered. And if you call in a number to Martin, they can look it up and they can tell you what model it was and what date that stamp was applied just from the number alone. But that date was stamped on the neck block when that instrument was nothing but a neck block, an end block, and bent sides. The guitar hadn't yet been assembled. It wasn't a complete guitar. There was no neck, no top, no bridge, no fingerboard, no strings. It wasn't a guitar yet. It was the beginning of a guitar. So it could be as much as 2 or 3 or even 4 months later that that guitar was actually in final assembly and done, strung up and ready as a complete instrument. So even for Martin, a serial number from December or even November of any one year does not necessarily indicate that it was actually completed in that year. Martin does have also records of completion dates, but this basic value of the guitar for most collectors, if they're thinking in terms of when was it made, they go by the serial number because that's also, although it was when the guitar was not yet complete, it is the date at which the specs of that guitar were set. If they were changing model specs, they would change the specs and start building, but they didn't change the specs of the guitar in midstream of production. If it has the specifications ornamentally and structurally that were being done at the time that serial number was stamped. So that's why those are considered, that's considered to be the date. Now with Gibson guitars, most of those numbers were stamped at the time that the instrument was completed and ready to be shipped. Unlike the Gibsons that have a factory work order number, that number was stamped early in production, and that can be months before the serial number was actually affixed. So it is not as straightforward as it might seem sometimes to say that the exactly what year the instrument was indeed made. His start date, his completion date. And anyway, plodding onward, we had a question that came in last week. Chuck Nicholson and I recently came into possession of a Gibson L12, serial number 90419. Has unusual fingerboard inlays. This is an early 30s guitar, and the L12 was a 16-inch guitar. It has compared to every other Gibson archtop of the era with picture frame inlays, it appears similar to those of the L12 and 34 catalog. The inlays are the same as the 1934 L5 Special, currently listed by another dealer. At any rate, here's pictures of what the catalog shows for that model. And these inlays, as well as inlays in the Gibson Century of Progress model that had a pearloid fingerboard veneer, were leftover banjo inlays. The inlays on the L12 were actually inlays left over from the TB5 Deluxe Banjo, which disappeared from the catalog after 1928. And they had a leftover bunch of fingerboards that were already inlaid. And instead of throwing that away, what they did is they cut out, they didn't remove the inlays from the fingerboard, they just cut squares around the inlays. And then they could inlay those blocks into fingerboards of guitars like this L12. But you can find L12s with that inlay, and you can also find some with other inlays. They were using up several different patterns, but primarily they used up the TB5 inlays on the L12 and on the L10 model. In fact, this picture shows the L10 is the one that's solid black, and the L12 looks the same, except it has sunburst finish. But the Century of Progress mostly used TB3 inlays. It had little diamonds and squares. But the point is they also were banjo inlays, and some of those Century of Progress models actually had the fancier inlays. You can find at least 3 different banjo patterns used interchangeably. They were using up leftover inlays, fingerboards that were not going to get used on banjos. And that's how come you have those inlays. They were not specifically designed for this model. And there are other examples in which Gibson would use discontinued inlay patterns, and rather than throw them away, they would use them. Jacek, J-A-C-E-K, says he's an audio engineer and guitarist, needs to purchase great sounding vintage acoustic for studio recordings. Says I've had bad experiences with large Gibson J200s being too boomy for recordings, therefore I'm more into smaller size bodies, especially in the studio situation. I used to own a new Martin OM28V. I like the sound, although the guitar did not have that vintage sound we all cherish, so I sold that one and acquired a Banner logo J45 from 43, but that one sounded kind of cowboyish. So my question is, what vintage instruments would you recommend within the budget of $5,000 to $6,000, medium-sized bodies, good investment, vintage acoustic guitars in good condition? I'm extremely picky about the sound of guitars, hence my job being a sound engineer. Well, in that range, I think the Gibson L00 guitars of the 1930s are excellent. Also, there's Gibson L1 guitars of that period that are very good. Martin, Single 18, 0018, those can be found in that range. And the ones that get into the late, into the 1940s and into the 50s, Single 00 and 0018 models fall in that range. A pre-war 00 is going to be more. but a pre-World War II Martin single O or double O 18 will be in that range, and they're extremely good guitars. There are also some very good new guitars these days, but since you're not looking for the larger body ones, we're not going to get into those, but in general, larger body Martins, dreadnoughts, and even triple O's pre-World War II are not going to be in that price bracket. They will be more. And the larger body Gibsons also will be more. But there are still some great sounding ones, just as I have mentioned. But in particular, the LOO, L1, and Martin single O and double O 18 models. And if you like a mahogany top, then Martin style 17s also pre-World War II. And those were available in single O and double O size, and also some smaller ones like the size 2 or 2.5 models. So those are in the size 1 Martins of the 1920s, right on up into the 30s. Those will fall in that price bracket. So there are indeed some good instruments. Don from Coleman, Alabama, to add a pickup or not to a vintage guitar. I have a great vintage guitar. I've never added a pickup. I use the guitar in the studio with mics and rarely take it out except for that purpose. She has been with me since 1970. If someone was going to add a pickup, is there one you would recommend that would not damage the instrument? Well, there are a variety of pickups that could fit in the sound hole that are completely removable. But if you're using it for recording in the studio, there's no reason to add a pickup. And if you want an electric acoustic to take out and play some gigs, frankly, you don't need to put a pickup in a great vintage guitar to get that sound. There are numerous guitars that really do remarkably well. And the guitars that have the most vibrantly alive acoustic sound do not necessarily happen to be all that great with a pickup on them. They're almost too much alive and too much vibration. They are far more likely to feed back, and you don't really get the sound of a true acoustic as heard either by the ear or by a good microphone by putting a pickup in it. So my general advice with most vintage instruments is don't put a pickup in them. And even with the absolutely best acoustic instruments, I'm inclined not to suggest pickups. But if you're going to put one in, the most invasive thing generally about the pickup is how are you going to plug it in? If you're going to put in an end pin jack, that will require, in most cases, reaming out the end pin hole bigger for an end pin jack. And would I do that on an extremely valuable vintage instrument? The one word answer is no. There are some end pin jacks that take a mini jack that can be done in a standard size end pin. And if I were going to do that in a vintage instrument, that's what I would recommend. And that can work quite well. And then you can do it with a variety of different style pickups. In general, putting an under saddle pickup in any really great sounding acoustic guitar reduces its volume and its dynamic range and really compromises the tone acoustically. And there's just not really much reason to put a pickup under the saddle of a truly superb sounding instrument, whether it's new or old. If it's acoustic, you're almost better off putting it in something that is actually less vibrantly alive acoustically. And the electric sound is likely to be better with one that is not necessarily the same guitar that you would use acoustically. John Parsons asks, with the death of Eddie Van Halen this week, I was wondering if you or Gruhn's ever conducted any business with him. I heard he had some interest in vintage guitars and wasn't totally into hot rods the hot rods he played on stage. Well, I have never personally dealt with Eddie Van Halen. He has never bought a guitar from me. I did, however, have the opportunity to read an interview with him that was in Guitar Aficionado magazine, and there were pictures of numerous of his guitars. Virtually every one of them had been butchered by him. He was, without a shadow of a doubt, a highly talented, enormously creative musician. But almost every vintage guitar he owned that was depicted in that article was totally butchered. And it was butchered by him. And there was an interview with him, and it had things like, such as he had a very nice Gibson SG original, early model. And he was doing a session, and he found that the cutaway horn was somewhat in his way. So he just asked for a hacksaw, and he didn't tell anybody what he needed it for. But then he brought a hacksaw to him, and he sawed the horn off the guitar because it was in his way. There was another guitar, a beautifully clean pre-CBS rosewood board Stratocaster that had his initials gouged in letters about that high. And he commented that he bought it from Dan Martin out of St. Louis area. And he paid the price for a very nice, beautifully clean guitar. And no sooner had he paid for it than, with Dan standing there watching, he took a sharp screwdriver and he just gouged his initials into it. And he commented that Dan was really upset. He says, well, it's my guitar and I can do what I want with it. He said, but why would you want to do that? He said, well, now I know it's mine. At any rate, I'm running an adoption agency for guitars. And if somebody treats their guitars that way, I don't care how good a musician they are. They're not going to get a guitar from me because I'm not going to send one of my babies off to that kind of a home. I view that virtually equivalent to mutilating or carving initials in underage children, or some of the genital manipulation and gouging that is done to a lot of young girls in various countries where there are some pretty practices that are should be outlawed. Anyway, enough for that. That's my thoughts. But was he a great musician? Absolutely. Was he an influential musician? Also, absolutely. Would I have wanted to sell a guitar to him? Absolutely not. Gary Marini, it's like, anyway, what are your favorite pickups that you are putting in sinker mahogany guitars? Does a 12 fret or 14 fret sinker need a different pickup? 12 and 14 fret guitars can use the same pickup. Do I recommend them as the ideal guitar for amplification? Well, I think I've already said that the better the acoustic guitar is, the less it really is screaming to have a pickup. But Vince Gill uses sinker quadruple O 12 fret and 14 fret guitars on tour and at the Opry. And he uses the D-tar pickups. We actually get more requests for LR Baggs pickups. They do a very good job. And the fact is that these pickups do not have to truly just mutilate a guitar. And the sinker models have drop-in saddles, so even if you don't take my advice and you have a saddle stick under the pickup, under the bridge saddle, it may dampen the acoustic sound, but if you don't like it that way, you can take it out, and with a drop-in saddle, you've done extremely little harm. You drill a tiny little hole in that saddle slot into the guitar, and it's really inconsequential. You're running a very small wire through a hole and hook up an end pin jack, and you can do it with a mini jack at the end pin. And you've really not hurt the guitar in any appreciable way. If you can take it out And frankly, nobody would know the difference if you did. So is it a horrible thing to do? No. Do I equate it with doing what Eddie Van Halen did to guitars? No. But if you want to see that particular interview, it wasn't an issue of guitar aficionado. You'd have to find the back issue because they're no longer in print. But it was a multi-page article, and it nauseated me. But again, that does not in any way take away from what an amazing musician Eddie Van Halen was and what an influential musician he was. The world is better for him having been there and shown a lot of people what could be done on a guitar. So that I don't take away from him, but I wouldn't want to sell him one of my guitars. Tom Van Tilburg has asked, in the past, you spoke on numerous times about playing a hollow body guitar really hard to wake it up. I've done this to my Gibson L4, and I'm amazed how wonderfully it worked. After really laying into it a short time, while my guitar sounds much fuller and the tones are even richer, it is as if my guitar is singing. I was wondering if you could explain what happens to the guitar physically when this happens. Should it be done each evening before I play it? Basically, if you vibrate it, you will limber it up a bit. It's effectively like giving a warm-up exercise. You don't have to continue playing it loud all the time you're playing, but even if an instrument has been played a great deal, you find that most guitars, if they're played really hard for just a few minutes as a warm-up, you can then play the rest of the evening soft and pretty, and they respond better for having been awakened. So yes, I do recommend playing it and waking it up. Not all guitars need as much waking up, but most guitars do respond better after a few minutes of hard playing, even if they are well acclimated. So yes, I would do that. And Blumenthal is asking a similar question about pickups for his 1933 Kalamazoo Gibson-made Kalamazoo brand. It's not a Gibson brand, it's a brand Gibson made as a student line, KG11. And that's one of their cheaper models, but with good setup, they still sound pretty good. They have ladder bracing, this transverse brace is not X-braced. Guitar is structurally intact, had an exit a few years ago, sounds very good, especially when fingerpicked, easy to play. What are the pros and cons of installing a pickup in such a guitar, and which type do you feel would sound best? Same type pickup in these is going to be the same type I would put in any other. And I think LR Baggs does make some very good pickups. K&K also makes good pickups, work well in acoustics. They don't go under the saddle, but you can't play it as loud as with LR Baggs or the D-Tar. It depends how big a place you're going to be playing. If you're playing in a big arena, the K&K is not going to do it. But if you want to really play loud with a bunch of electric instruments, that's also not going to do it. But overall, guitars that are really, really fun to play acoustically are not necessarily the best to put a pickup on. So it's plodding onward a bit. John O'Brien in Bishopville, Maryland. Before the world ended, and I'm sure he means the pandemic, I used to play mandolin in an Irish traditional session at an Irish pub. We were paid in pints, pints of ale. A number of people played the old Martin mandolins from the 1930s to 60s. They cut through the session and have good volume. Does Martin plan to start making any new mandolin or mandola models If you do, we need electronics as well. I found vintage instruments need the help of a good luthier in order to get them playable for everyday use. We have one in inventory, but it does not look very playable. I'm not so sure the price for an unplayable 100-year-old instrument. I'm not capable of fixing these instruments. Well, first, what I would say is at this time, Martin does not appear to be ready to start getting back into mandolin production. They're having enough trouble keeping up with the guitar demand right now. And a lot of the companies are finding that with the COVID virus pandemic, they're having difficulty actually keeping up with the demand, partly because they're doing social spacing in their factories. So if they space people out more, they have to work, put it in shifts. They can't have as many people in the building at once. A lot of times their office staff is working remotely. They're not doing factory public tours, and they're back ordered. This is not a time for Martin or others that were thinking that maybe they'll start mandolins to do it. And in general, the most popular mandolins tend to be the carved top, carved back designs that are either Gibson mandolins or basically inspired by Gibson. There's a lot of mandolin makers today producing carved top, carved back mandolins that are the design patterns that were originally done by Gibson. And those tend to be also a longer scale than the flat top, flat back Martin mandolins, which had a 13-inch scale like a violin. And the later mandolins had more like a 13 3/4-inch scale, which is actually more comfortable for most players. And interesting enough, also puts the fingers more in the position that they would be on a violin, because on a violin, there's no frets. Now, the Italian makers and the early Martin mandolins are 13-inch scale, the same as a Martin. But that means actually that your fingers are closer together, the spacing, when you're fretting it, because you're playing behind where your finger would go if there were no frets. So if you want to have the feel of finger spacing similar to a violin, in order to do that on a fretted instrument, the scale actually needs to be longer, which was Gibson's theory when they did their mandolins, and it actually works quite well. Almost everybody I deal with who is seriously interested in mandolins is playing either a Gibson or a mandolin inspired by Gibson. There are plenty available. There are numerous makers, a wide variety of price brackets. And but do all old instruments need a tremendous amount of work to be made playable? No. If they were built right in the first place and they've been well maintained, they can be quite structurally stable. They are sturdier on carved top mandolins and carved back than flat back models. And they're also less likely to need a neck set than a flat top guitar. But again, vintage instruments, whether they're guitars, banjos, or mandolins, is set up in good playing order, can be every bit as playable as any new ones. But there are plenty of different mandolin options, but in general, I would prefer to recommend a carved model rather than the short scale, earlier design instruments. Brandon has a question. I recently acquired a 1941 Martin 0018. When purchasing online, I knew the guitar was very worn and had some repairs, but it seems there were a few small cracks near the pickguard, fairly tight, that have not been attended to. Would you recommend any repair to be done there, or am I best served keeping the instrument well humidified when needed and watch it? My initial thought was that the pickguard, having shrunken, may need to come off and be reattached, but I'm not sure if these cracks are indicative of that issue. I bought the guitar to enjoy and play more than to collect or invest in. That said, I would like to enjoy the guitar for a long time to come and take care of it in the best possible fashion. My other acoustics live in a humidity controlled cabinet and though not being played, so I'm trying to gauge what other care I should take given that I've never owned something with this much age or wear on it. All right, when the pickguard has shrunken and caused the top to crack, that is not a humidity issue. And humidifying it is not going to solve that problem. And if you do not remove the guard to release the pressure, eventually it's going to cause those cracks to open up more. And it can cause very serious damage if it's not attended to. Caught reasonably early, it's a very simple repair. You remove the pickguard and you can reattach it with a glue that is more give to it, not quite as hard and firm as the earlier glues they used for that. But also you can do the repairs on the cracks so that they are stable, put the guard back and you're ready to go. And it should not give any trouble later, or at least probably not in your lifetime. But I would very definitely recommend that that work should be done. It's not a humidity issue. Karsten Haslett, could you please discuss Gibson factory reneck guitars in the 1960s? Did this actually happen? I saw one that was 1962 with a 1964 neck, serial number 99540. Could you discuss what type of repair is needed to fix hole and side hole that was repaired by an amateur using epoxy? Well, without seeing the hole in the side, I can't tell you what it needs. If there's missing wood, then it can be spliced in. And if somebody is really skilled at it, you can hide it to the point it may be very, very difficult to even find. It also may turn out to not be a serious structural issue. It's cosmetic if it's a small hole. But did Gibson reneck guitars in the 60s? The answer to that is they did quite a few. Frequently, what happened is that a guitar may have needed a neck set, and back in the 60s, Gibson and Martin, neither one really seemed to know how to take a neck out and do a neck set. And I was at the Gibson factory in 1969, and I visited their repair shop. They had 13 people working in the department at that time, and it seemed to me that almost everything they touched, they ruined. I saw guitars where their standard technique, if a neck needed to be reset, since they didn't know how to get it out, they would take a hacksaw and they'd simply saw the neck off at the body and then chisel out the end block to get the dovetail piece of the original neck out, and then they'd stick in whatever they considered to be the closest equivalent new neck and consider that fixed. It's a pretty horrific thing to do to a vintage instrument, and it can virtually destroy any real originality or value. The monetary value plunges. And they also refinished a lot of instruments that certainly didn't need it. And if a guitar had original patent applied for humbucking pickups and the pickup covers were tarnished, rather than telling people to leave it alone, they'd take them out and put in brand new pickups. That's not a good thing to have done. Almost every instrument that they touched in the 60s was bad news. And frankly, Martin's repair shop in the 60s also did things that were maybe not quite on that level, but not good. They refinished a lot of guitars that should not have been. They did not do good crack repairs, and they also didn't know how to get a neck out at the dovetail. So they would simply plane the fingerboard. It was paper thin at the nut and full thickness by the 12th fret. So it gave it a slightly different angle. And they would file the bridge down. When they got done, to make it what we consider right, it would now need a new bridge and a new fingerboard and a neck set, where before all it needed was a neck set. And we sure as heck do know how to get the necks out now, and so does Martin. The Martin repair shop these days actually does very good work, but they sure didn't back in the 1950s or 60s. They knew how to make good guitars. They just didn't seem to know how to repair them. And it's a strange but quite true fact that some of the finest repairmen I've known were not great builders, and some of the finest builders I've known didn't know how to fix the guitars that they made. If it developed a crack, they didn't really seem to know how to fix it near as well as they knew how to make a new top. But repair and building are separate skills. If a builder has work so distinctive that you can say it's a signature you can recognize from across the room, that can be a compliment. If a repairman's work is so distinctive that you can recognize it from across the room, that's bad news. Because the best repairman's work should be invisible. They should be able to take something that looks like a truck ran over it and put it back together so it looks perfect. Kind of hard to do, but that's the ultimate wish list. So, okay, onward. Tad born, Clarksville, Tennessee. What resources did you use early in your career and today to educate yourself regarding stringed instruments and their history and value? There's a heck of a lot more material available today. When I started collecting guitars in 1963, there were no books available on the subject. There were no catalog reprints available. There were old guys who worked in music stores or old musicians who had a good memory and knew what had been going on. And some of the companies still had employees who'd been with them a long time. But when I was in Chicago, going to Nazareth, Pennsylvania to ask them about it, or calling them up at the factory and expecting to get somebody on the line who'd been there since 1940 or the 1930s, that wasn't going to happen. I mean, the fact is, in 1963, Martin still did have some people employed there who'd been there in the 1930s, just as today, Gruhn Guitars has been in business for 50 years, and now we're in the 10th month. Now, well, sure enough, I've been around a long time. In 1970, when I opened up my store, a 50-year-old instrument would be 1920. So there were people I could talk to. Even a Martin serial number list was not available in 1963. Now there's dozens of books available. There's plenty of dealers also. Not all dealers are equally knowledgeable, but plenty of them are knowledgeable. But there are books. There's information online. There's all sorts of sources now. If you're really sincerely interested in learning, you can build up a fine library. You can find several dozen books, enough to keep you busy reading for quite a while. I can assure you that still isn't all there is to know, but there's enough to keep you busy. And there's some pretty darn good, well-researched books on the history of companies: Martin, Fender, Gibson, Rickenbacker, Gretsch, Guild, even companies such as Ibanez. They've done a book. And, so there's a goodly number of companies. Framus, there's a book about their history. Lots of them, and there's also some fine books on classical guitars. You can easily build up, you can spend several $1,000s buying a library of books about the subject. And if you're seriously interested, there's plenty of information out there now. When I started out, there was virtually none. So you're living in an age now, and there's a great deal of information and resources available to you. So that is good. Joe Privatera, George, would you please share your experience with Martin D45s, especially your early finds? You know, in 1976, I had 6 pre-war D45s in my personal collection. And they're plenty rare because they only made 91 of them total. But I'd already discussed my very first one that I ever owned. Fellow Frank Rizzuto in Chicago called me. He was a jazz player, and anytime he got a flat top guitar that was good, he'd call me. I was still a college student at the University of Chicago, but when I found good jazz guitars, I'd call people like him. And there was another one in Chicago, Fred Rundquist, a fine, fine jazz player. And if I got a great jazz guitar, he knew that I'd be happy to trade them for a good old Martin. And he didn't like Martins at all. Neither one of those guys liked Martins. They were both fine jazz players, and they liked Gibsons, Angelicos or Strombergs. Fred Rundquist had Gibsons. He had Albanus. He had Angelico, he had Stromberg, he had some great guitars. I learned a lot from him, but he did not like Martins. If he got an old herringbone D28, he'd call me and be anxious to trade it for a good jazz guitar. Well, Frank got a Martin one day and he called me up. He said, George, I got this Martin. I've never seen one like it, but inside I look at it, it says D45. Is that good? I said, yes, that's real good. I'd like to have that. How much do you want for it? He said, I need $600. I told him, just hang on, I'll be there in 20 minutes. And that was the first D45 I got. It was in 1940. Excuse me, it was in 1937. It was a wonderful guitar. And actually, no, I'm wrong. It was a 39. It was a 1939 D45. It had hexagon inlays. But that was my very first one. And I kept that particular one until 1976. I was thinking about liquidating. The market seemed to be stagnating, and I wanted to buy a house and a business building. And I liquidated some of those guitars and ended up owning a business building and a house. But I wish I had them back now. Bill Easton, I have inherited a Gilt Blonde archtop electric Stewart X500 in fair to good shape. Is it worth much? It has the original hard case. Well, we do have an appraisal service. Just go to our website, guitars.com, click on the appraisal button. But is it a good guitar? Yes. That's a 17-inch wide, full depth, single cutaway guitar, 2 pickups. And it has the fancy inlays with square pro block inlays on the fingerboard with abalone center wedges in the middle, gold-plated hardware. That's a good instrument. Definitely professional quality, fine jazz guitar. And and he says in further that it was purchased new by his brother in the late 1950s. So that would be a very good instrument, well worth appraising. And if you play guitar, one that you may want to just keep, and if you're a jazz player, it's a fine instrument. Susan Ashley Wallace, curious, did you ever sell Alan Collins or Gary Rossington any of their guitars in the Lynyrd Skynyrd band in the 70s? And apparently I did sell Rossington a Sunburst Les Paul. I've been asked about it a number of times. And unfortunately, quite honestly, I don't really clearly remember. But I've read that I did. And I dealt with so many rock players that my personal interests, especially back in the 70s, were primarily acoustic. A lot of really well-known rock players came in and bought guitars from me, and they were just customers. I don't even claim that I remember everything I sold to them, but I can tell you I sold guitars to Eric Clapton. I sold a few to the Stones. I sold a bunch to Billy Gibbons. And So it goes on and on. I had lots of customers. Rick Nielsen with Cheap Trick bought over 100 guitars from me in the 70s. Steve Howe with Yes bought over 100 guitars from me over the years. And do I claim that I remember all of them? I remember having dealt with them, but I don't remember some of what they bought. John Myers has a fancy Martin a guitar that's a relative modern Martin fretboard binding separation where it joins the body. He saw one for sale recently online, the same issue in the same place. It all happened with this Steve Miller Pegasus I own. Poor quality control, or was there some particular peculiar manufacturing issue with limited edition Martins made? Martin's quality control is extremely good, but there have been times when there have been glitches with finish and with binding materials. And typically these are issues that not only can be problems for Martin, but can be problems for other manufacturers as well. Martin and others don't make their own lacquer, they buy it. Back in the 70s, Stuart Mossman had problems, and so did Martin with Sherwin-Williams lacquer. But they had batches where they changed their formula. They didn't tell the manufacturers. They bought the lacquer. They used it as they had before. And the stuff went bad and caused enormous problems. And similar issues have happened with some, particularly ivoroid bindings, where ivoroid is flammable. The manufacturing process, if it's done poorly, can result in binding that is chemically unstable. There are other types of plastic also that have caused problems. For example, Gretsch and some other New York makers back in the 1950s and 60s had serious problems with binding issues that they had no way to know. They thought plastic would be indestructible and wouldn't crumble and just turn to dust or crack. But some batches that you see, particularly on Gretsch guitars, a lot of binding rot, some of the Epiphone guitars, and even makers such as Angelico used some of the New York distributor plastic bindings, such that you end up having to rebind Angelico guitars. And you also see pickguards that did that. Now, these are supremely good builders, but if they bought any materials that turned out to be problematic, these are quality issues that can even result in legal problems between the supplier of the lacquer or other material and the manufacturers. They could lose $1 million. You buy a few gallons of lacquer and you spray it on guitars that are expensive, and the lacquer goes bad because the manufacturer mixed it in a way that is a time bomb. I don't blame Martin for that, or the others who encountered the same problems. But Stradivari and Guarneri mixed their own varnishes, and they were also natural vegetable-based materials, or some plant and animal materials, but the point is they were biological, and they had a pretty darn good idea that these things were not also already just going to implode on them. Old French polish and varnish finishes are durable. Modern lacquers and modern plastics, sometimes if it's going to have a 40-year time bomb, that you might think that's not a problem. You're selling a guitar, and by the time it has a problem, you might be dead. But these days, my company has been in business. I've been in business for now 50 years and 10 months. That's long enough to see things that were new early in my business career that are now causing serious problems. Tortoise shell bindings and pickguards that are crumbling, some ivoroids that are causing problems, lacquers that turned out to not be stable. So these are issues of concern. Shall pivot regarding acoustic guitar pickups, can they be removed by a skilled luthier with no negative impact to the guitar? How would you enlarge the end pin hole? How would the enlarged end pin hole be addressed? I have Martin Custom 00028 that I would like to remove the undersaddle pickup from. Yes, you can remove the undersaddle pickups, and there'll be nothing visible at the bridge. If it's a drop-in saddle, you pull the saddle out, pull the pickup out, take it out. So far as the end pin, the easiest is to just leave the end pin jack there. It accommodates the strap anyway. There are also some end pins that will fit that larger hole, so you don't necessarily have to fill it. But if you want it to look absolutely original, you can put a plug into the hole and re-drill it and put a new end pin in it. That's a lot more work, and it still may leave some visible trace. It's a lot easier to just put a slightly larger end pin in it, or else just simply leave the end pin there. Usually, if it has a pickup in it, it's not a guitar. It's so collectible that you need to go to great lengths on getting the exact original style end pin. If it was a pre-World War II Martin D45, you shouldn't have done that job in the first place. You should have left alone and not put a pickup in it. But in general, pickups can be removed. And the value of a relatively modern post-World War II guitar is not going to be seriously affected. So here, let's see if there's any that I have missed. Overall, I think we've had a pretty good session for today. I'll look forward to more questions next week. And if anybody's question hasn't been answered, send me an email, george@guitars.com, and I'll make doubly sure to be absolutely certain to get it into next week, and also can send you a personal email in reply as well. So I do personally read all the emails that come in to me. If they're addressed to me, I read them. And if they have a question that is remotely intelligible, I will answer it. So fan mail is always welcome. And if people disagree with me and have a logical reason, I'm very open to reading that as well. So I don't learn anything new simply by answering questions that I already knew the answers. And if somebody disagrees with me and can prove me wrong, I learned something new. So I welcome people who disagree to please contact me, because constructive criticism is good. Constructive debate is a good thing. I learn much more if somebody proves me wrong than if all I do is stay with the same opinions for a lifetime. If confronted with new information, I'm old enough that I may have to unlearn something, or at least change a long-held opinion if presented with evidence that it was not accurate. So please stay in touch. George@guitars.com, or if you want a phone, shop phone number 615-256-2033. I'm generally in Monday through Saturday. We open at 10. We close at 6. Sometimes I'm not in till 10:30. But I often stay quite a bit later than 6, but we don't answer the phone after 6. But at any rate, I'm reachable, and I'm happy to talk to anybody who wishes to speak to me. Till then, look forward to talking to you again next week, and keep those questions coming. The more, the better. Thank you.